If you've been around the manga scene for a while, then there's a fair chance that you've heard the word gekiga being thrown around when referring to certain works. However, the meaning of the word can be somewhat hard to ascertain when referring to manga being released today, and for good reason too, as it is a term to come out of an era of the manga industry that is very different from the one we have today. You see, the term was likely first used in the late 1950s by the legendary artist Yoshihiro Tatsumi. In this period after World War II, manga had seen an explosion in popularity, but was still largely a medium exclusively targeted towards children. Tatsumi, alongside a handful of other artists, renounced this idea that manga was something meant solely to entertain, and they coined the term gekiga as an alternative. The word literally translates to dramatic pictures, as opposed to the whimsical pictures derived from the word manga. It bears similarities to how American cartoonist Will Eisner started referring to his works as graphic novels instead of the supposedly more juvenile comic books in the 1970s. These creators would come together to write a gekiga manifesto detailing the ideals behind their movements, and throughout the 1960s and 70s, these artists would produce several works of gekiga comics, which, as the name implies, focused on telling dramatic and serious stories for an older audience of readers. There sprung up a clear divide between the gekiga artists, largely based in Osaka, and the mainstream manga market centered around Tokyo, which was also called the Tezuka faction after the legendary creator of Astro Boy, Osamu Tezuka. In the beginning, Tezuka stood in strict opposition to the movement, understandably so, as many of the styles and ideas that the gekiga artists were rebelling against were the very same ones that Tezuka himself had popularized in the early 50s. Even so, as we approach the 1970s, even his works start to show more and more influence from the mature storytelling of the gekiga movements. This is evident from several of his manga from this period, like The Book of Human Insects, Ayako, and Mu, all loaded with themes of society, violence, and sexuality. This shift in attitude, alongside the huge commercial success of gekiga-inspired series like Lone Wolf and Cub and Golgo 13, meant that by the late 70s there was a big market for comics blending the two styles together, and as time went on, what was and wasn't considered gekiga only became more and more hard to determine, simply because Japanese comics were no longer in a place where they could be arbitrarily divided into one of two camps. The result was that manga went back to being something of an umbrella term referring to Japanese comics as a whole, even those meant to target a more mature audience. And today, the word gekiga is mostly confined to these specific works released in the 1960s to mid-80s, though sometimes you'll also hear it used about modern alternative manga heavily influenced by this specific era. If you're interested in learning about the centuries of manga history leading up to the gekiga movement, then you can check out this video that I did on that very topic. Or, if you want to know more about a modern outlet for experimental manga, then check out the previous episode of Manga Minutes where I talk about a very peculiar manga magazine from the early 2000s. This has been Evan God, and I'll see you next time.